The name on the paper was Silas Hayes, written in her dead brother's shaking hand, and it was the only reason Celia Langley had not lain down in the snow and let the Nebraska winter take her. She had found the papers 3 weeks after burying Edmund in the frozen ground outside of Omaha, when she finally worked up the courage to go through his saddlebag. Edmund had been 26 years old, and he had coughed himself to death in a boarding house that smelled of mildew and boiled cabbage, and the last thing he had asked of her was to find the man whose name was written on that folded piece of paper. He had gripped her wrist with fingers that were already cold and told her that Silas Hayes was a good man, an honest man, a man who would see her right. He had said it like it was the most important thing he had ever said in his life, and maybe it was, because those were nearly the last words he spoke. Celia had not asked Edmund how he knew Silas Hayes or what the man had done to earn such a description. She had not asked because Edmund was dying, and because she was 23 years old and alone in the world, and the question felt too large to hold in a room that small. She had just listened, and then she had watched her brother go, and then she had sat with the cold body until the boarding house keeper had knocked on the door and told her in a tone both gentle and businesslike that she would need to make arrangements. The arrangements took 4 days. The burial took a morning. And then Celia had packed everything she owned into 2 saddlebags, sold the last of Edmund's small savings to purchase a sound mare from a livery on the edge of town, and she had set her face southwest toward Wyoming territory, where the paper said Silas Hayes kept a cattle ranch outside a town called Garnet Creek. 3 territories. That was what stood between her and that name. Nebraska in December was not a place that welcomed travelers. The wind came off the plains like something with a personal grudge, and the roads, what roads there were, disappeared under drifts that could swallow a horse to the knee. Celia had grown up in Illinois, had spent the last 2 years following Edmund west as he chased one opportunity after another, and she knew how to be cold. But this was a different category of cold entirely. This was the kind of cold that made a person feel that the world itself had decided to be hostile. She rode through Nebraska with her wool coat buttoned to the throat and a blanket pulled over her shoulders like a shawl, and she talked to her mare, who she named Ruth because Ruth had gone where she was not from and had survived it. She told Ruth about Edmund, about the way he had laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them, about the way he had always believed that the next territory was the one where things would finally go right. She talked because the sound of her own voice kept the silence from becoming something she could not bear. She crossed into Colorado territory at the beginning of the 2nd week, and there she found 2 things. A small trading post run by a woman named Mrs. Petra Voss, who fed her salt pork and hot coffee, and did not ask too many questions, and a snowstorm that kept her pinned inside that trading post for 3 days while the wind shrieked around the eaves like something living. Mrs. Voss was a broad German woman in her 60s who wore her white hair in a braid as thick as a rope, and had a way of looking at a person that suggested she had seen everything the frontier could produce, and was not particularly surprised by any of it. On the 2nd evening, sitting by the cast-iron stove with cups of coffee between them, she asked Celia where she was headed, and Celia told her. "Wyoming," Mrs. Voss said, as though tasting the word. "That is not a short ride in any weather. In this weather it is a very long one." "I know it," Celia said, "and there is someone waiting for you there, or you hope there is." Celia looked at the fire through the grate. "I don't know which one," she said honestly. "I have a name on a paper my brother gave me before he died. The man whose name it is doesn't know I'm coming." Mrs. Voss was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your brother trusted this man, more than he trusted most people." Edmund was careful about who he trusted. He was careful about everything. Celia paused. Except his health. He wasn't careful enough about that. Mrs. Voss nodded slowly and refilled both their cups from the enamel pot on the stove. "A name on a paper is not nothing," she said finally. "Sometimes it is exactly enough." Celia held that thought close for the remaining days of the storm, and when the wind finally died and the sky went the particular shade of blue that meant the worst was over, she saddled Ruth and rode on. Colorado was harder country than Nebraska in some ways and easier in others. The mountains on her western horizon were enormous and white and beautiful in a way that made her chest ache, and the valleys between the foothills offered some shelter from the worst of the wind. She stopped at a small settlement where a blacksmith rishad Ruth's left front hoof for a price that was fair, and where a woman at the general store pointed her toward the road north and gave her a piece of dried apple cake wrapped in brown paper, asking nothing in return. There were people like that on the frontier, Celia was discovering. People who understood that a lone traveler was a fragile thing and that a small kindness cost almost nothing. She crossed into Wyoming territory on a morning when the sky was the color of pewter and the air smelled like snow that had not yet decided to fall. She knew she had crossed because the landscape changed in a way she felt more than saw, something in the quality of the light and the width of the sky, and because she came around a long bend in the trail and saw a wooden marker half buried in a drift that said, in faded painted letters, Wyoming Territory, Laramie County. She stopped Ruth and looked at the marker for a long time. 3 territories. She had done it. The ranch outside Garnet Creek took another 2 days to find. Garnet Creek itself was a small town, a single main street with a general store, a saloon, a land office, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and a handful of other establishments strung between them like beads on a wire. The people she asked for directions were careful with her in the way that frontier people were careful with strangers, measuring her with their eyes before they committed to anything. But when she mentioned the name Silas Hayes, something shifted in their expressions. Not suspicion exactly. Something more like recognition, mixed with a kind of quiet respect. The man at the general store told her the Hayes Ranch was 4 miles north of town, past the fork where the creek bent east, and that she could not miss the gate because it had a carved wooden sign above it. He told her this with the manner of a man giving directions to something that mattered, and she thanked him and bought a small bag of dried beans and 2 strips of jerky and rode north. She found the gate just as the afternoon light was starting to go pale and long across the snow, and she stopped Ruth at the road's edge and simply looked at it for a moment. The gate was a solid timber construction, 2 tall posts with a crossbeam above, and the carved wooden sign hanging from the crossbeam read Hayes Ranch, EST, 1878. Beyond the gate, a long lane ran between fence posts toward a cluster of buildings. She could see in the middle distance a house, a barn, what looked like a bunkhouse, several outbuildings. Smoke was rising from 2 chimneys. There was a horse in a paddock near the barn, a big dark animal that raised its head and looked at her. And there was a man standing at the gate. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, wearing a heavy canvas coat and a brown hat dusted with snow. He had his back to her at first, doing something with the latch on the gate, and then he turned as if he had heard Ruth's hooves on the snow despite the fact that she had been standing still, and looked directly at her. Celia felt her heart do something complicated. He was perhaps 30 years old, with a face that was weathered and strong-boned, dark eyes under the brim of his hat, a jaw covered with several days of dark stubble. He was not handsome in any conventional way that she might have described before this moment, but standing there in the white and gray late afternoon, with the smoke rising behind him from his own chimneys, he was the most real-looking person she had ever seen. Solid, she thought, like something that had grown out of this ground rather than simply standing on top of it. He looked at her with an expression she could not read at this distance, guarded perhaps, but not unkind, and after a moment he walked toward her with an unhurried stride. "You've come a long way," he said. It was not quite a greeting and not quite a question. She stared at him. "How do you know that?" "Your horse," he said, nodding at Ruth. "She's tired right through to her bones, and you've got the look of someone who's been riding through weather for more than a few days. Also, you've got your coat on inside out." His voice was low and even a Texas accent underneath the plainness of the words. Celia looked down at her coat and found that he was right. One of the buttons had a piece of lining showing where she had dressed in the dark that morning. She looked back up at him. "Are you Silas Hayes?" He went still. Not startled exactly, more like careful. "I am," he said. "My name is Celia Langley," she said. "Edmund Langley was my brother. He died 3 weeks ago in Omaha. Before he died, he wrote your name on a piece of paper and asked me to find you." She reached into her coat and produced the folded paper, worn soft at the creases from handling, and held it out. He did not reach for it immediately. He looked at her face first for a long moment, and she could see something moving behind his eyes. Grief, she thought, real grief. He had known Edmund, he had liked him. "Edmund's gone," he said quietly, and it was not a question. "He is," she said. "I'm sorry to bring you that news this way." Silas Hayes took the paper from her hand, unfolded it carefully, and read it. His jaw tightened once. Then he folded it again and put it inside his own coat, close to his chest, and he looked back up at Celia Langley, who was sitting on an exhausted mare in the gate of his ranch at the end of a journey that should have broken her, and something shifted in his expression. It was not pity. She was glad it was not pity. "Come inside," he said. "Your horse needs the barn and you need a fire and a meal." He reached up and took Ruth's bridle with the practiced ease of a man who had handled horses all his life. "We can talk after." Celia dismounted, and her legs nearly failed her when she touched the ground. She caught herself on the stirrup and stood for a moment, breathing, refusing to fall over. Silas Hayes watched her do this without making a fuss about it, which she appreciated more than she could have said. 3 territories in December," he said, almost to himself, as he led Ruth through the gate. "Edmund always said you were the stubborn one." Celia fell into step beside him. "He told you about me." "Enough." He glanced at her sideways. "He said you were the one with the sense God gave a sensible person, and that he was the one who caused trouble, and that between the two of you you'd have made a decent whole human being." She laughed, and it surprised her, the sound of it, real and unbidden. She had not laughed since before Edmund died, and it hurt a little coming out, the way feeling coming back into cold fingers hurt. "That sounds like him," she said. The barn was warm and smelled of hay and horses, and that particular animal comfort that Celia had come to love on the trail. Silas settled Ruth into a clean stall with practiced, unhurried efficiency. Water first, then he rubbed her down with a cloth, then grain, talking to her in a low voice the whole time. Celia stood and watched him do this, and found that the watching told her something about him she could not have gotten from words. He was not performing care. He was just caring, with the easy confidence of a man who did it without thinking. A young ranch hand appeared from the back of the barn. A boy of about 19 named Tom, who had sandy hair and an open, earnest face. Silas sent him to let the cook know there would be a guest for supper and to make sure the spare room in the house had a fire laid in it. Tom went at a trot, glancing back at Celia with frank curiosity that he did a poor job of hiding. "Your man?" Celia asked. "1 of 4, Silas said, smoothing a blanket over Ruth's back. "Good hands, all of them. Tom's been with me 2 years. He's got a good eye for cattle and a tendency to talk too much, but you can't have everything." He showed her to the house then, which was larger than she had expected and built with a solidity that spoke of permanence and intention. The main room had a stone fireplace big enough to stand in, a table of heavy oak, shelves of books along one wall, and a rag rug on the plank floor that someone had made with care. There were a few small things on the mantelpiece, a pocket watch, a small photograph in a tin frame, a piece of quartz that caught the firelight. It was a house that had been lived in by someone who meant to stay. The cook was a Mexican man named Roberto, who was short and silent, and produced from the kitchen, in what seemed like an impossibly short time, a pot of venison stew that was so good Celia had to concentrate to eat it slowly rather than in an undignified rush. There was also cornbread and dried apple preserves and coffee that was strong enough to stand a spoon in. She ate at the big table while Silas ate across from her, and they were quiet for most of it in the way that two people can be quiet together when the situation is large enough to require it. When the stew was gone and they were on their second cups of coffee, Silas said, "Tell me how he died." So she told him. She told him about the cough that had started in September and the way Edmund had waved it off, the way he always waved things off, the gradual graying of his face over those weeks, and the doctor who had said pneumonia, and looked at Edmund's spent savings, and said it in a way that made the word feel like a verdict. She told him about the last 2 weeks in the boarding house, and the way Edmund had fought it with a cheerfulness that had broken her heart, telling jokes even when talking made him cough, and looking out the window at the street below, with the expression of a man who had simply decided not to be afraid of what was coming. She told him about the morning he had asked her to find Silas Hayes and what he had said. Silas listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his hands around his coffee cup, looking at a point somewhere beyond her shoulder. "We rode together for about 8 months, he said finally. 3 years back before I settled here. Edmund was the best judge of whether I ever met and the worst judge of a card game. He won me a bet once that kept us from going hungry for 2 weeks, and he lost a bet another time that cost me a good saddle. He kept the score even." "That sounds right," Celia said. "He talked about you," Silas said. "Not constantly, but the way a man talks about something he considers important carefully, like it mattered to say it correctly. He said you'd raised him more than your mother had after your father left. He said he owed you more than he'd ever figure out how to repay." Celia set her coffee cup down carefully. "He didn't owe me anything." "He thought he did." Silas looked at her directly. "He wrote to me 6 months ago. Asked me if I had any work or any room, said he was thinking of bringing you west and getting settled somewhere proper. I wrote back and said yes to both." He paused. "The letter I sent got there after he died, I suppose." Celia felt the shape of that settle into her. Edmund had been making plans. He had been writing letters and thinking about the future while he was already getting sick, and he had not told her because he had not wanted her to worry, or perhaps because he had not wanted to admit to himself how serious it was. She pressed her lips together for a moment and looked at the fire. "He didn't tell me," she said. "No," Silas said. "That seems like Edmund too." They sat with that for a moment, and then Celia squared her shoulders and looked at him directly. "I don't want to be a charity case," she said. "Whatever Edmund asked of you, I am here on my own terms. I can work. I know horses and I can cook and I can keep accounts. I was a schoolteacher for 2 years in Illinois. I'll earn my keep or I'll find another situation in town." Silas looked at her for a moment with an expression she was beginning to identify as the one he used when he was taking a person seriously. "I have no doubt of that," he said, "and the offer stands regardless. Edmund was a friend, you're his sister, that's enough." He stood and picked up the coffee cups. "Get some sleep. The room's ready. We can figure out the rest in the morning." The room was small and clean, with a quilt on the bed that had been made with obvious skill and a small stove that Tom had gotten going so that the air was warm when she came in. Celia sat on the edge of the bed and held Edmund's letter, her copy, the one she had carried, and read it one more time. Then she folded it and put it in her pocket and lay down in her clothes, meaning only to close her eyes for a moment. She slept for 14 hours. She woke to pale winter light coming through the single window, and the smell of coffee and wood smoke, and the distant sound of activity outside, men calling to each other, the creak and movement of a working ranch starting its day. She washed her face and hands in the basin on the dresser, changed her shirt from her saddlebag, and went out. The kitchen was empty, but the coffee was hot, and there was a cloth-covered plate on the table that held biscuits and cold bacon, left for her deliberately. She stood at the window with her coffee and watched the yard. Silas was at the fence of the paddock, watching 2 of his hands work a young horse that was not yet sure it wanted to be worked. He stood with one boot on the lower rail and his arms on the top rail, patient and quiet, and every now and then he said something to the 2 men that Celia could not hear. The horse was a bay, young and nervy, and it was beginning slowly to move with less panic and more trust. She watched him watch the horse, and something quiet and unguarded settled over her, the way it does when you observe someone who doesn't know they're being observed. She took her coffee and her biscuit and went outside. The cold hit her like a wall, clean and dry and very still this morning, the sky a brilliant winter blue. Her breath made plumes in the air. The snow in the yard was packed down by boots and hooves into a firm surface that crunched underfoot. She walked to the paddock fence and stood beside Silas, about 3 feet away, and watched the horse. He glanced at her. "You slept," he said. "I did," she agreed. "Thank you for the food. Roberto leaves it nothing to do with me." He turned his attention back to the horse. "How are your legs?" she considered. "Sore, but holding me up." "Good." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I was thinking if you're willing, you could help with the accounts. Roberto is good with a kitchen and Tom is good with horses, but none of us are good with numbers, and I've been falling behind. There's 2 years of ranch ledgers that need organizing." Celia looked at the side of his face. He was not looking at her. He was very carefully watching the horse. She could see a faint color at the back of his jaw that had nothing to do with the cold. He was not offering charity, she realized. Or not exactly. He was offering work, real work, and he was embarrassed to need it in a way that touched her more than if he had offered it easily. "I can do that," she said, and that was how it started. The first weeks were a careful negotiation of space and routine. The ranch ran on a schedule as tight as a clock before dawn. The hands were up and doing the morning feeding and checking on the cattle in the north pasture, which in winter required vigilance, because the creek that ran through the pasture froze in sections, and cattle were not always clever about where they tried to drink. Silas was usually the first person in the yard each morning, and he worked harder than any of his men, which they seemed to know and to respect him for. Celia established herself at the big table each morning after breakfast with the ranch ledgers, which were indeed in a state of some complexity. Silas kept records, which was more than many ranchers did, but they were organized in a way that made sense only to him and somewhat inconsistently at that. She worked through them methodically, cross-referencing sale records against expenses, building a cleaner system as she went. She had always been good with figures. It was one of the things Edmund had teased her about, calling her the human abacus, and she found genuine satisfaction in bringing order to the tangle of numbers. Roberto brought her coffee without being asked, and seemed to have adopted a protective attitude toward her that she found both unnecessary and quietly pleasing. Tom asked her questions about everything with the cheerful persistence of a puppy, and told her, unprompted, that Mr. Hayes was the best rancher in the county, and that he had never seen him argue with a single person in 2 years. Not even when Hicks from the neighboring spread tried to move his fence line 6 feet into the north pasture, and Mr. Hayes had merely gone over and moved it back without raising his voice or his hand. And the way Tom told this story made it clear. He considered it one of the great demonstrations of character he had witnessed. The other 2 hands were brothers named Cal and Drew Ferris, both in their mid-20s, both dark-haired and taciturn in the way that brothers sometimes are when they have been talking to each other their whole lives and have already said everything. They were polite to Celia and nothing more, which she considered entirely appropriate. In the evenings after supper, Celia and Silas often found themselves at the table together, she with the ledgers and he with whatever correspondence or reading occupied him. They talked, at first carefully and then with increasing ease, about the ranch and about the country and about books, which it turned out both of them read with a seriousness that delighted them both. He had a shelf of novels and histories and a worn copy of Emerson that had been read so many times the spine had been repaired with leather. She had, in her saddlebag, a copy of Jane Austen and a book of Tennyson's poetry that had been Edmund's, given to him by their mother, which made it the most precious thing she owned. Edmund read poetry, Silas said when she showed him the book one evening. He did, she said. He was embarrassed about it, so he only read it when he thought no one was watching, but I always knew. Silas turned the pages carefully. Did he have a favorite? The one about the brook, she said. He said it was the most honest thing he'd ever read, that a brook just keeps going regardless of what it passes through, and that seemed correct to him. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "I'm glad he had you." The words landed on Celia like something warm and weighted. She looked at the fire rather than at him. "He made it easy," she said. "Edmund made most things easy, even when they were hard." She became part of the rhythm of the ranch in a way that felt, surprisingly quickly, natural. She rode out with Silas twice a week to check the north fence line, partly because the exercise was good for her and Ruth, and partly because she had said she wanted to understand the operation, and he had taken her at her word. She learned the names of the cattle, or enough of them to get by, and learned to read the weather from the quality of the light on the mountains, and learned that the big dark horse in the paddock was named Bishop, and that he was Silas's personal horse, and that the two of them had been together for 6 years, and had between them a relationship of complete mutual understanding that she found beautiful to observe. She also spent one afternoon a week in Garnet Creek, first to collect the mail and secondarily because she had introduced herself to the woman who ran the town school, a brisk, red-haired woman named Mrs. Oakes, and found that Mrs. Oakes was very much overextended with 23 students of varying ages and very much in need of assistance. Celia began helping with the younger children 3 afternoons a week, teaching reading and arithmetic and the rudiments of writing to children between the ages of 6 and 12. It was on one of these afternoons in Garnet Creek that she first encountered the other thing about the town, the thing that the people there did not talk about directly, but that lived under the surface of almost everything. The town had an Indian agent's office, a small wooden building at the edge of the street, and there were sometimes Arapaho people in town, men and women who came to trade or conduct necessary business with the government offices. The way they were treated made Celia's chest tight with an anger she found hard to name. The men at the saloon who sneered, the storekeeper who pretended not to see them until he chose to, the agent himself, a soft-handed man named Caraway who spoke to them with a paternalistic condescension that made her want to say something sharp. She mentioned it to Silas that evening. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know it." He was looking at his coffee cup. "There's a family, the Spotted Eagle family. Their place is about 12 miles northwest of here. The father, James, he worked for me 3 years ago before the new rules from the agency made that harder. Good man, good horseman." He was quiet again. "What's happening to the Indian nations in this territory, what's happening across all the territories, it's not a thing I have the words for that are big enough." "No," Celia said. "Neither do I. I do what I can," he said, "which is not enough." "But I do it." She believed him. She had seen it in small ways, the fair dealing, the respect in his manner when he encountered people the town's establishment looked down upon, the way he paid Roberto twice what the going rate was and spoke to him as one man speaks to another. Silas Hayes was not a man who made speeches about his principles. He lived them in the quiet, daily way that was. She was learning, far harder and more real than speeches. She was falling in love with him, and she knew it, and she was not sure what to do about it. It was a strange thing to feel in the middle of grief. Edmund had been gone barely 2 months, and there were mornings when the weight of that came down on her so hard she had to stand still wherever she was and breathe through it. She would be in the middle of adding a column of figures and suddenly see Edmund's face clearly, not the sick face of the last weeks but his real face, laughing at something only he had found funny, and the figures would blur and she would have to put the pen down. Silas noticed. He was, she was discovering, a person of considerable quiet attention. He noticed things about the people around him the way he noticed things about his land and his animals, without making a production of it. He did not try to talk her out of her grief or rush her through it. He simply made sure there was coffee when she needed it, and that the fire was always going, and that the work was always there when she wanted to hide in it. One evening in late January, when the temperature outside had dropped to a depth that made the windows of the house seem very thin, He came in from the yard and found her sitting in the chair by the fire with the Tennyson open in her lap and her face wet. He did not pretend not to see it. He pulled the other chair close and sat down across from her and said nothing, just present, and she appreciated that more than any words. After a while she said, "I keep thinking I need to tell him things. I'll see something, a hawk or a particular quality of snow, and I'll think I have to tell Edmund about this, and then I remember." "Yes," Silas said, "that doesn't go away in my experience. It just becomes something you carry rather than something that stops you." She looked at him. "Did you lose someone?" He was quiet for a moment. "My father, 7 years ago, and before that my mother. I was young when she died, but my father, we worked this land together for 2 years before he was gone. Sometimes I'm out on the north pasture and I think he would have said something about this light, and I almost hear him." The fire crackled between them. Outside, the wind made a sound like something breathing slowly. "Edmund would have liked this place," Celia said. "He would have liked you. I mean, I know he already did, but he would have liked knowing you in this life, the settled life. He kept looking for the right place to be settled." "He talked about settling," Silas said. "The last time I saw him, about a year before he wrote the letter, he talked about it seriously. He said he was tired of moving. He said he wanted to be somewhere for a long time." He paused. "I think he might have found his way here eventually, with or without the letter. He wrote to you because he trusted you most," Celia said. It came out quieter than she intended. Silas looked at her steadily. "I know that was true for him. I'm glad he did." She looked back at the fire. The words were sitting right there, things she could say. Things about the way she had started watching the door when she heard his boots on the porch. About the way the evenings felt different from the days in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. About how she had started dreaming about staying here and had not told herself to stop. But the words stayed where they were. It was Tom who said it first, inadvertently and with complete obliviousness to what he was doing. He was repairing a section of fence near the barn one afternoon in early February, while Celia was brushing Ruth in the paddock nearby, and he talked the entire time with the effortless ease of someone for whom silence was a kind of discomfort. "You know," Tom said, hammering a nail with cheerful precision, "the boys and me were saying just this morning, we've never seen the boss as good-humored as he's been this winter. Cal says he's seen him smile more in the last 6 weeks than in the whole year before. Drew says that's not true, but Drew says everything is not true. I think Cal's right, though." He glanced over at her. "Not saying it's because of you specifically, Miss Langley. Could be other things." He then hit his thumb with the hammer and swore, and was so occupied with the aftermath of that he did not notice Celia standing very still by Ruth's neck with her brush, suspended in midair, and a warmth in her face that had nothing to do with the temperature. She finished brushing Ruth with considerable deliberateness, and went inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hands flat on the table. Roberto looked at her from the stove with the expression of a man who had already arrived at his own conclusions about various things, and was keeping them to himself. That evening she and Silas rode out to the east fence line together, just the two of them, because Silas said he wanted to check on a section that Cal had reported as damaged by a fallen tree. The day was clear and cold, and the snow on the mountains to the west was lit gold by the late afternoon sun in a way that made everything look like a painting of itself rather than the actual thing. They rode in comfortable silence for most of it, which was something she valued enormously. She had never before been with someone whose silence felt like company rather than absence. Bishop and Ruth moved well together, which seemed appropriate. They found the damaged fence section, a length of 3 posts knocked sideways by the tree that Cal had cut away, and Silas dismounted and walked the length of it, testing the remaining posts, assessing what would need replacing. Celia dismounted and stood with both horses and watched him. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He looked up at her over his shoulder. "Yes." "When Edmund wrote to you, when he asked if you had work and room, did he tell you anything specific about me, other than what you've mentioned?" Silas turned to face her fully. He was perhaps 20 feet away, standing in the snow with his gloves in one hand and his hat pushed back slightly. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she had learned meant he was deciding how honest to be. "He said you deserved better than what you'd had," he said finally. "He said you'd given up things to take care of him and that it wasn't right and that he wanted to see you settled and safe before he was done." He paused. "He said if I met you, I'd understand what he meant. He was right." Celia looked at him across the snow. "Silas," she said. "Celia," he said, at the same time, and they both stopped, and the silence between the two names was the loudest thing she had ever heard. He crossed the distance between them in 4 or 5 strides, and she met him halfway, and when he took her face in both his large, calloused hands, she felt the whole length of the journey, all 3 territories, all those weeks of cold and loneliness and grief settle and release in a single exhaled breath. His hands were warm against her cold face. His eyes, up close, were very dark and very direct. "I don't know the right way to say this," he said, with a directness that was entirely characteristic of him. "I've known you 6 weeks, but I think you might be I think you might be someone I could—" "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "I haven't finished." "Yes, anyway," she said. He laughed, and she felt it as much as heard it. A genuine, surprised sound, and his forehead came down to rest against hers for just a moment. And the horses stood patiently in the snow around them as the sky turned gold to rose to the first deep purple of evening. And she thought that Edmund, wherever he was, had probably known exactly what he was doing when he wrote that name on that paper. He kissed her, finally, carefully, with all the seriousness of a man who had thought about this and decided it mattered. She kissed him back with everything she had. The ride home was different from the ride out. Not noisier, they were still quiet mostly, but the quality of the quiet had changed. It was a warm quiet, a shared one. Silas rode with his shoulder close enough to hers that their arms touched occasionally on the trail, and he kept looking over at her with an expression that she thought he might not even be aware of, something unguarded and wondering and new. Roberto, when they came in, looked at both of them and said absolutely nothing, and Celia suspected he had been waiting for this for weeks. The remaining days of February had a glow to them that she could not have justified on any rational basis, given that the temperature was still frequently below freezing, and the north pasture still required constant watching, and the ranch ledgers were still mid-organization. But there it was. She woke in the mornings now with something to look forward to rather than just something to do, which was different from anything she had felt since long before Edmund died. She moved through the days with a sense of purpose that felt full rather than merely busy. Silas was, she searched for the word and settled on steady. He was steady in a way she had not encountered before in a man, which was to say he was the same person in every situation she saw him in, the same patience with the horses and with his men, and with the complexities of the ranch, the same directness of expression whether he was talking about fence line repairs or about the books on his shelves, or about the feeling that had established itself between them. He did not perform anything. He was not one version of himself with her and another with the world. This, she realized, was what Edmund had known and had been trying to give her, not just safety. Safety was the minimum. He had been trying to give her this particular man, this particular steadiness, this feeling of being known accurately rather than romantically guessed at. On a clear morning in the first week of March, with the first very faint suggestion that somewhere under all this winter there was a spring wanting to happen, Silas asked her to ride into Garnet Creek with him. He had business at the land office and she had the school in the afternoon, and it was a natural enough thing. But he was unusually quiet on the ride in and she found herself watching him. "Something on your mind," she said. He glanced at her. "Obvious, is it? You've been quiet in a different way than usual since breakfast." He was quiet for another minute, which was so very much like him that she had to suppress a smile. Then he said, "I want to ask you something and I want to say it correctly, and I've been trying to find the correct way since about 5 this morning." She waited. "I know it's soon," he said carefully. "I know you're still in your grief, and I know you came here on a hard road and you're still finding your footing, and the last thing I want to do is push you towards something before you're ready. So what I want to say is not a pressure. It's a question. Ask it, she said. He looked at her directly, reins held easy in both hands, Bishop moving steady under him. I would like to marry you, he said. Not immediately, not if you're not ready, but I would like that to be where we're headed. I would like you to know that's what I want. The mountains were very white against the blue sky. A hawk was making long, slow circles above the valley. The road beneath them was firm with winter, but there was a smell in the air that was almost not winter anymore. I would like that too, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Yes, yes, she said. The smile that came over his face was slow and transformative and private, meant only for her, and she felt it like a hand on her chest. They rode into Garnet Creek together. The wedding was in May. Not small exactly, because the town of Garnet Creek turned out for it with the enthusiasm that small frontier towns reserve for occasions that are genuinely worth celebrating, which are fewer than they'd like. Mrs. Oakes cried, which she would have hotly denied to anyone who asked. Tom gave a toast that was earnest and slightly too long, and genuinely moving in a way that nobody expected. Roberto made a cake with dried fruit and spices that was, objectively, the finest thing Celia had eaten in the West or possibly anywhere. The ceremony was in the church schoolhouse, with the Reverend Michaels officiating, a thin, kind man who had been in Garnet Creek for 7 years and had presided over weddings and funerals, and the whole range of human occasion with a sincerity that Celia appreciated. She wore a dress that Mrs. Oakes and 2 women from town had helped her make over the preceding weeks from blue wool and white cotton, not elaborate but good, the kind of dress a person could be proud of without being consumed by. She carried a small bunch of dried flowers that she and Silas had gathered together on a walk in late April, pressed and saved. Silas at the altar was exactly himself. No performance, no nervousness, just present and direct and looking at her with those dark, honest eyes as she walked up the aisle on her own because there was no one to give her away, and she would not have had it any other way. She had given herself to this territory and to this decision under her own power, and she walked to him under her own power, and he watched her come with an expression that she thought she would remember with absolute precision for the rest of her life. He said his vows in a plain, steady voice, looking directly at her. She said hers in a clear voice that only shook slightly once, at the part about for the rest of our lives, because those words had a specific weight when you had recently watched someone you loved lose theirs. Afterward, standing outside the church in the May sunshine with the mountains snow-capped and brilliant above the valley and the sound of the town celebrating spilling out around them, Silas put his hand on her face the way he had at the east fence line in February, and she turned into it the same way. Edmund knew, she said. He did, Silas agreed. He was always smarter than he let on. Don't tell him that, she said. He'd be insufferable. Silas laughed, and she felt it the same way she always did, like something good and real and solid. He'd love being right, he said. He'd never let either of us hear the end of it. No, she said, smiling. He wouldn't. They went home to the ranch in the early evening, with the sky going all rose and gold behind the mountains and the smell of spring genuinely present now, no longer just hinted at. Roberto had left supper on the stove, and a bottle of wine that he had produced from somewhere inexplicable on the table, and there was a note in his neat handwriting that said simply, with feeling, "Congratulations." They ate dinner by the fire and talked for a long time, the way they had talked since those first evenings, about everything and nothing, covering ground that was familiar and finding new ground in the familiar, the particular pleasure of 2 people who are good at talking to each other and know it. He told her things about his childhood in Texas that she had not heard before: his mother, who had died of fever when he was 8, his father who had been a hard man and a fair one, and who had taught him to love land the way you love a thing you intend to keep. She told him about Illinois and about the schoolroom where she had taught and about her father leaving when she was 12, the simple, terrible fact of it, and the way she and Edmund had reorganized themselves around the absence. "You became his parent in some ways," Silas said. "In some ways," she agreed. "But he was still older. He still had his own ideas. Sometimes those ideas were better than mine, and sometimes they were catastrophically wrong, and the trick was knowing which was which." "Did you always know?" "No. But I was right more often than he was." She looked at him sidelong. "I'll probably be right more often than you too." He considered this with the solemnity it deserved. "Probably," he said. "I'll try not to be too resentful about it." The summer on the ranch was the richest thing Celia had ever experienced. Not in any material sense. Though the ranch was doing well, the cattle were healthy, and the calf crop was strong, and Silas had made a deal with a buyer in Cheyenne that would keep them comfortably through the following year. Rich in the other way, the daily accumulation of small pleasures and shared work, and the particular satisfaction of a life that was being built together. She continued the school in town 3 days a week, and she continued the ledgers, and she learned more about cattle than she had expected to ever know, and she rode the land until she knew it the way she knew the lines on her own hands. She learned Bishop's preferences and moods, and the way he sometimes tried Silas's patience on cold mornings with a display of stubbornness that was so specifically theatrical it was hard not to find funny. She learned Silas in the way you learn a person you share a life with, his habits and his silences, the particular way he went still when he was thinking hard about something, the way he was with his men, demanding in his expectations, generous in his acknowledgement, utterly fair. The way he was with her in private, direct and warm, and occasionally silly in a way he never was in public, as though he kept that part of himself specifically for her, which she found it delightful to receive. She also learned that he carried things without talking about them, which was the one habit she wanted to change if she could. Not because it frightened her, but because she could see it cost him, the quiet carrying of difficulties. She worked at being someone he would talk to about those things, not by asking directly. He was not a man who responded to that, but by being present in the right way at the right times, and gradually he began to speak more of the things he had previously held alone. One of those things was the question of his neighbors and the changing territory. "Hicks is pressing again," he said one evening in late August, sitting on the porch with the last of the daylight going orange across the pasture. "Not about the fence this time. He wants the water access on the North Creek. He says his cattle are being crowded out of the lower sections." "And are they?" Celia asked. "No more than usual. His herd expanded and he didn't account for the range he'd need. That's his problem, not mine." "But he's going to make it your problem." "He's going to try." Silas was quiet for a moment. "Hicks is not a bad man. He's a pressured man. He's got debt and he's got a crew he can't quite pay, and he made some choices 2 years ago that I don't think he'd make again. But right now those choices are pushing him in a direction I don't want to go." "What will you do?" he considered. "Talk to him, directly before it escalates. Offer to share the North Creek access at certain times in a way that doesn't cost me anything real and might give him enough room to breathe." He looked at her. "I'd rather give a little and keep peace than hold the line and end up in a fight that's bad for both of us." "That's the right answer," she said. He glanced at her. "You didn't even have to think about it." "I've been right about most things," she reminded him. He laughed quietly, and they sat together as the sky went from orange to rose to the deep, soft dark of a summer evening in Wyoming, and the cattle were still in the far pasture, and the stars came out one by one, and the porch was very peaceful. The conversation with Hicks happened, and it went well enough better than Silas had expected, and roughly as Celia had predicted. Hicks took the offered arrangement with a gruffness that covered relief, and the two ranches went on as neighbors in the way that frontier neighbors go on, which is to say with plenty of space between them and a grudging mutual respect. In September, Celia realized she was expecting a child. She sat with this knowledge for 2 days before she told Silas, not because she was uncertain about telling him, but because she wanted to sit with it herself first, to let it settle and become real. She walked the pastures and thought about Edmund and about her mother, and about the particular shape of the life she was making, and she felt something very large and very complete gather inside her chest. She told him on a Sunday morning after breakfast, sitting at the big oak table with the autumn light coming through the windows. She said it plainly, the way she said most things, and she watched his face. He was still for a moment that she would have called stunned, except that it was not a frightened stillness, but an overwhelmed one. The stillness of a man receiving something so good it requires a moment to absorb. Then he reached across the table and took both her hands in both of his, and the look on his face was the most unguarded and beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Celia," he said, and that was all, just her name said in that voice. "Yes," she said, the same way she'd said yes to everything that mattered. He came around the table and sat beside her and put his arm around her, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat there for a long time in the morning light. The autumn deepened into the particular beauty of a Wyoming fall, all gold and amber, and the deep blue that the sky seemed to save for October. Celia worked through her pregnancy with a practicality that slightly alarmed Silas and amused Roberto, continuing the school and the ledgers and the writing, though she gave up the longer rides to the north fence with some reluctance. Mrs. Oakes, who had raised 5 children of her own and had very firm views about pregnancy, appointed herself unofficial advisor and appeared at the ranch with some frequency, bearing opinions and dried herbs, and a book about infant care that Celia read from cover to cover with great seriousness. Roberto, who had 3 younger siblings, also had opinions that he expressed through the specific medium of increasingly nutritious meals. Tom, when he found out, turned an extraordinary shade of red and congratulated them with a sincerity so extreme it was almost funny. Cal and Drew nodded and shook Silas's hand, and that was that, which was very much in character for them. Silas built a cradle over the course of November, working on it in the evenings after supper, doing the joinery with a care that he usually reserved for fence repairs that actually mattered. She would sit across from him with her book or the ledgers and watch him work, the lamp throwing warm light over both of them, and the evenings had a particular quality to them that she thought she would carry the rest of her life. The sound of the wood and the faint smell of shavings and the fire and the man across from her, making something for what was coming. "It's beautiful," she told him one evening, running her hand along the finished rail of the cradle. He looked at it critically. "The join on the left side is not perfectly smooth, Silas." It's beautiful," she said again. He looked at her, and the small smile he gave her was the private one, the one he kept specifically for her. "All right," he said. "The baby came in February, exactly 1 year after the conversation at the east fence where Silas had first told her what he wanted, which Celia privately found to be the sort of symmetry that life very rarely bothers to provide, and which she chose to take as a sign of something. The birth was attended by Mrs. Oakes and a capable midwife who came from Garnet Creek in the freezing cold without complaint, and it was hard in the way that births are hard and fine at the end. The baby was a boy. They named him Edmund. Silas held him for the first time with the careful, exact attention of a man holding something irreplaceable, which Edmund the younger was. Celia watched them together from the pillow, exhausted to her bones and more awake than she had ever been in her life. "Edmund Hayes," Silas said quietly, looking down at the small face. "Your brother would have liked that," said Mrs. Oakes, who was perhaps not supposed to have heard but who had been in the room and was not apologetic about it. "He would have been unbearable about it," Celia said from the bed. "He would have told the story of it everywhere he went for the next 10 years. Silas looked up at her. "Good," he said. The winter passed and the spring came again, and little Edmund grew with the alarming speed of all healthy babies, and the ranch thrived, and Celia's life took on the full, layered quality of a life that is being genuinely lived rather than merely survived. She kept teaching in Garnet Creek, and over the following years she became genuinely essential to the school, not just in the afternoons, but as the primary teacher when Mrs. Oakes' health began to decline, running a classroom of 30-odd children with the calm authority that came from actually knowing what she was doing. She loved the teaching. She loved the particular moment when a child who had been struggling suddenly understood something, the way a face changes in that instant, the small interior ignition. She thought Edmund would have recognized that moment and known what it meant. She also continued the accounts with the growing precision of someone who had come to find genuine intellectual pleasure in the work. The ranch's books, under her management, became a model of clarity that Silas pointed to, with the mix of gratitude and slight embarrassment of a man who knows he would have made a complete mess of it on his own. "You're too smart to be on a cattle ranch in Wyoming," a man at the Cheyenne Cattle Exchange told her once when she accompanied Silas to negotiate a sale. She had looked at him steadily. "I disagree," she said, and that was the end of that. Little Edmund, at 1 year old, was so specifically like his uncle in certain expressions, the particular way he looked at things he found interesting, with a slightly tilted head and a brightness around the eyes, that Celia sometimes had to step outside for a moment and breathe. Not because it was painful, exactly. More because the feeling it produced was too large for a room. She had long conversations with Edmund's memory, in the way that the dead let us have conversations with them if we're willing. She told him about his nephew. She told him about Silas and the ranch and the school and Roberto's cooking and Tom's talking and the mountains in every season. She told him he had been right and that she was glad he had written the name on the paper, and she thought she could almost hear him, somewhere in the back of the good things that surrounded her, laughing at his own joke before he finished telling it. When Edmund was 2 years old, Tom finally worked up the nerve to court a girl in town, the blacksmith's daughter, a quiet young woman named Priscilla who turned out to be funnier than anyone expected, and who found Tom's endless talking endearing rather than exhausting, which Silas said was the clearest evidence of divine intervention he had encountered on the frontier. They married in autumn, and the whole ranch celebrated with the warmth of people who had become, over the years, something that functioned like a family whether or not the law called it that. Roberto produced another extraordinary cake. Tom's toast was even longer than the one he had given at Silas and Celia's wedding, and reduced Priscilla to tears of mixed laughter and genuine emotion. Cal and Drew shook Tom's hand, and that again was that. In the 3rd year of their marriage, Celia became expecting again, and this time the baby came in summer, a girl they named Martha, for Silas's mother whose name he had carried quietly for 33 years and never found the right occasion to give to anyone until now. Martha was born with dark hair and the same serious dark eyes as her father, and she arrived in the world with an expression of careful evaluation that made Roberto say she would be running the ranch by the time she was 12. He was not entirely wrong about that. Edmund was 4 when Martha arrived, old enough to understand that the baby was his to protect, which he took to with a seriousness that was deeply characteristic of a child who had somehow inherited, through some alchemy of name and love and circumstance, some quality of the man who had held Celia's wrist in a boarding house in Omaha and made her promise to find a name on a paper. The years gathered. The ranch grew. Not extravagantly, Silas was not a man who confused growth with goodness, but steadily and well, with the quiet accumulation of right decisions made year after year by people who knew the land and respected it. The north pasture was expanded once, carefully, with attention to the creek and the winter grazing patterns. A new barn was built when the old one began to show its age. The bunkhouse was improved in ways that made it actually comfortable rather than merely habitable, and Silas paid wages that kept good men rather than chasing cheap ones. Celia's school grew too. By the time Edmund was 7 and Martha was 3, the Garnet Creek School had 38 students, and Celia had been formally appointed as the head teacher by the town's school board, which paid her an actual salary that she invested directly back into books and materials. She wrote letters to the Territorial Education Office every year about the need for more trained teachers and better funding. And some years the letters produced results, and some years they produced polite non-responses. But she wrote them regardless, because the writing was honest work, and honest work was worth doing. She also taught, in the evenings twice a week, any adult who wanted to learn, men and women who had come west without education and who wanted it now, who wanted to read their own documents and write their own letters and know that their accounts were not being falsified. Several of those students were ranch hands and tradespeople from the area. 2 were Arapaho women whose husbands were in business with the town and who had decided that reading English would serve them better than the agent's interpretations, which Celia found to be the most purely rational educational motivation she had encountered. Silas's relationship with James Spotted Eagle and his family had continued and deepened over the years into something that was, in its quiet way, a genuine friendship, an exchange of knowledge and assistance and plain human company that existed apart from, and in spite of the official apparatus of government that made most relationships between white settlers and native people something fraught and diminished. Celia had come to know James's wife, a woman named Sarah who had a sharp intelligence and a dry sense of humor, and who made better tea than anyone in 3 counties, and she valued that friendship specifically and without apology. She was aware, always, of the larger injustice that framed it, the way that the policies of the government continued to take and constrain and diminish, the way that the Arapaho people were being pressed from all sides by forces that had nothing to do with fairness and everything to do with the desires of people who were not there. She did not pretend that her friendship with Sarah Spotted Eagle solved or addressed this injustice, because it did not. She simply refused to participate in it where she could, and she taught her children the truth about it, and she used her voice and her letters when she had the opportunity. On a spring evening in the 6th year of their marriage, Celia was standing on the porch watching the last light on the mountains. They were purple and gold in the specific way they were only at this hour in April, when Silas came and stood beside her with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one and put his arm around her shoulders. And they stood there together the way they had stood at fence lines and paddocks and church doors and kitchen tables over the years, which was simply together. With all of what that had come to mean, "You know what I was thinking today," she said. "Tell me." "I was thinking about that first day, standing at the gate with Ruth. I couldn't see inside the fence from the road, you remember. I could only see the sign and the smoke and you." She paused. "I was so tired I could barely stand, and I was thinking this might be nothing, this name might be nothing, and then you turned around." He was quiet for a moment. "What did you think?" She considered this honestly, the way she always did. "I thought you looked like someone who lived here," she said. Not like someone who was visiting or passing through or working until something better came along. You looked like part of the place, and I thought, whatever else this is, that man is not going anywhere." He looked down at her. "You thought all that in about 4 seconds. I'm efficient," she said. He laughed, and she felt it against her side where his arm was around her, and she leaned into him with the full, settled confidence of a woman who knows exactly where she is and has chosen it completely. "Edmund was smarter than both of us," she said. "He was," Silas agreed. "Don't ever tell him I said that. He can't hear you." "He absolutely can," she said, with complete certainty, and Silas did not argue with this because he had learned, over 6 years, which arguments were worth having, and this was not one of them. The mountains went from gold to rose to the deep luminous purple that came just before dark. Inside the house, Edmund Jr. was explaining something at length to his sister, who was listening with the tolerant patience of a 3-year-old who has decided to be patient, and Roberto was producing from the kitchen a smell that promised something with onions and venison, and possibly those dried chilies he kept in the tin on the second shelf. Bishop stood in the paddock in the near dark, a dark shape against the lighter snow on the mountains behind, absolutely still in the way he went still in the evenings, as though the horse himself were being settled into the day. The gate at the end of the lane was just visible in the last light, the carved sign above it barely readable, but there, solid and permanent as it had been the first day she saw it and would be, she expected, for a very long time to come. Hayes Ranch, ESD, 1878. She had crossed 3 territories alone in winter to reach a name on a paper. The name had been alive and standing at the gate, and here she was, standing at it too. Celia Langley Hayes drank her coffee and watched the last light leave the mountains and felt the absolute, complete, settled rightness of a life that had arrived exactly where it was supposed to be, by exactly the road it was supposed to take, which was not the easy road, and not the short road, and not the road that anyone looking at her at 23, standing by her brother's grave in Omaha in December with nothing but a name on a folded paper, would have predicted she would survive to the end of. Edmund had known. That was the thing she had come to understand most completely over these years. Edmund had not been dying and desperate and grasping at a name to make his sister feel better. He had been thinking clearly, with all the sharpness of a person who knows their time is short and cannot afford to be wrong. He had known Silas Hayes the way you know people when you have ridden hard country with them and trusted them in bad situations and watched them choose, over and over, the harder right thing over the easier wrong one. And he had known his sister the way you know someone you have grown up beside and depended on and loved imperfectly and gratefully, and with the specific attention of a person who was paying attention. He had known that a woman with enough stubbornness to cross 3 territories in December was not going to be made small by whatever came after. He had known that a man who lived in his land rather than merely on it would know what to do with a woman like that. He had handed them to each other through a piece of folded paper and a journey through the snow, and he had been right. And Celia thought that wherever Edmund Langley was, he was laughing that laugh starting before the joke was finished, and she hoped he could see the porch and the mountains and the gate and the smoke rising from 2 chimneys, and she hoped he knew that it was good. That it was all of it, every hard and beautiful piece of it, so thoroughly and completely good. Inside, Edmund Jr. called something and Martha made a sound of protest that suggested a boundary had been crossed in whatever game they were playing, and Roberto said something brief and authoritative that settled the matter, and the warm light from the windows fell across the porch boards at Celia's feet. Silas pressed a kiss to the top of her head, unhurried and certain. "Come inside," he said. "It's getting cold." "In a minute," she said. She stood in the last piece of the day, in Wyoming, in the spring of 1885, on a ranch that was hers as much as it was anyone's, with the full life she had made filling every room of the house behind her, and the dark mountains still faintly visible against the darkening sky. And she breathed it all in, the cold, clean air, the smell of wood smoke, the distant sound of cattle, the particular quality of the silence that was never quite silent out here because the land was always making some small sound. Wind or water or something living moving through it. Then she turned and went inside, where the fire was going and the food was almost ready and her children were arguing over something that would not matter in 5 minutes and her husband was pouring coffee at the stove, and the door closed behind her and the lamp light made everything warm. The gate stood at the end of the lane in the dark, solid on its hinges, the carved letters of a name just visible against the sky. It had stood there before she came. It would stand there long after. But she had come, and that was everything, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was exactly, precisely, completely right.